When you buy a house, what are the top 3 rules when buying your house? It's location, location, and location. And when it comes to building a strong team at work, what are the top 3 things? It's people, people, and people. If you have the right butts in the right seats, is ultimately the highest impact driver on your success.
Welcome to Commit and Push, the podcast about how great software really gets built. I'm Damien Filiatro, your host and the founder of Scalable Path. Each episode, I talk with founders, developers, and leaders about the decisions, trade-offs, and hard lessons behind successful digital products. Let's get into it. Joining me today is Zach Goldberg, CTO of Gruntwork and the author of the Startup CTOs Handbook. He's been a CTO for multiple companies, and in addition to being an avid race car driver and pilot, he also does executive coaching for CTOs. Zach, welcome to the Commit and Push podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Damien. Great to be here.
Yeah, my pleasure. So to start us off, you want to tell our listeners a bit about your background and how you got where you are today?
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. So, I'm a software engineer by training. I got my undergraduate in software engineering, and just over the course of early part of my career, I just found I loved startups. And so I was at a handful of startups in my early 20s, and for the past 12 or so years have been an executive at a startup in one way, shape, or form. A couple of them I've started myself. Most of them recently I've joined sort of after a Series C, Series A kind of stage, brought in to sort of help mature the technical organizations and help them scale and sort of achieve efficiency and organization amongst the tech team. And a couple years ago, I was working with a larger team and really just enjoying that process. I was really lucky to work with some really great other managers and some very talented engineers. And just there was this feeling that things were working well. And I started capturing what were some of the key ideas that we were implementing as a team that seemed to be working very well in practice. And then battle testing those ideas with other leaders that I was talking to and sort of came up with a handful of frameworks that seemed to apply relatively universally at tech startups. And that ultimately transitioned, or that became the manuscript for the Startup CTOs Handbook, which was published in 2023. And along with that, I started doing some executive coaching, working with other technical executives, technical leaders. And it's truly a blessing and an honor to, work with so many talented people, both at Gruntwork, helping to, advance the state of infrastructure as code, but also with other leaders who are building their own awesome startups. And if I can be even a little bit helpful to them and help the startup community broadly, that brings me great satisfaction.
What company was it where these experiences came out where you decided to start documenting it?
Yeah, at the time, the name of the company was GrowFlow, but they were acquired about 6 months before I wrote the book by Dama Technologies.
Yeah, and that was actually a client of Scalable Paths, if I recall. Yeah.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah.
It's taken me back a few years.
Yeah. And now that you're at Gruntwork, do you want to just talk a little bit about what you guys do and what you've helped build there?
Yeah, Gruntwork is a very unique, super cool company. So in startup years, it's basically ancient. It's an 8-year-old company that still fashions itself a startup in the sense that it's bootstrapped. They've never taken outside capital and was profitable from day one. And so as an organization, we're probably about the size of a typical Series A company, about 20 employees or so, and including contractors, et cetera. But it started early on as an infrastructure as code and DevOps support. Very early in the company's history, it released a tool that many listeners might be familiar with called TerraGrunt, which is sort of a wrapper or layer around Terraform and today OpenTofu to add additional capabilities. Nowadays, TerraGrunt is sort of a premier infrastructure as code at scale tool. And today, Gruntwork publishes, of course, we still work very hard on TerraGrunt. We work on about half a dozen other open source tools, primarily in the infrastructure as code space. And we have an enterprise platform that helps enterprises scale out their infrastructure as code. It helps central platform teams create scalable infrastructure as code in their enterprise.
Awesome. What are some of the challenges you guys are facing over there? Is everything just running smoothly?
I'm not sure there's a startup in the world. Anybody who says their startup is running perfectly smoothly is lying to you. But yeah, no, things are going great. The infrastructure as code space is very interesting. Actually, it's fortuitous we're talking today, because today, after whatever it is, 14 months or so, The acquisition of HashiCorp by IBM is finalized, and so there's a lot of buzz in the industry today specifically around what that means for the future of things like Terraform itself. Of course, the open BAU community is interested, the open tofu community is interested, and so it could be a while before we see what direction IBM is going to take things. But certainly today is a bit of a turning point there. We work with mostly larger enterprises on the commercial side of Gruntwork. And so, we see pretty similar patterns that lots of other companies see working with Fortune 500s. In 2025, there's a lot of belt tightening. Everybody's focusing on efficiency. There's a lot of focus on profit numbers sort of across the board. And so, we're looking to see how do we, with our tools, help organizations, get extra impact and efficiency out of the investments that they're making, sort of along the lines of a lot of AI pushes that you're seeing. And so, how does infrastructure as code fit in a world with lots of generative content and tools? And it's a great time to be paying attention and innovating in that space.
Cool. So how do you split your time between your CTO job and the coaching that you do?
Yeah. So, Gruntwork is my full-time job. I'm, a committed full-time CTO at Gruntwork. And so I have to structure my time as a coach, or I should say I structure my coaching practice to fit in with the fact that I have a full-time job. And so as a coach, I work with people on a sort of fixed basis. And so I make a commitment, usually an hour a week per client to work together, which is the same style of executive coaching that I actually subscribed to for the first 10 or 12 years of my career. And so by and large, it fits in pretty nicely. There are meetings that show up on the calendar. I do a little bit of prep work for those and take some notes, things like this. But by and large, throughout, the 8 to 12 hours a day that I'm sitting at this desk here, the vast majority of that is on Gruntwork and a couple hours here and there for the coaching clients.
Gotcha. And one more sort of general question before we dive into the book. I'm curious, did you consider yourself an author before you started this process? And what was the experience of writing the book like? Did you get help? Did you basically do it yourself? How was that process?
I love this question. I feel like I've learned a lot throughout this process. And in particular, the short answer to your question is no. I never saw myself as an author. But there's a lot of interesting things that I think lots of authors learn throughout the process of trying to write their first book. The first thing I would add is it's hard for everybody. Anybody who says it was easy to write their first book is probably lying to you. Similar to any startup that doesn't have any stress. Part of being a leader at any organization, whether it's in person, remote, and regardless of your function, does involve learning to write well, or at least learning to write quite a bit. Whether it's documentation or process or onboarding, performance reviews, like whatever it is, management sort of just involves writing. And so I do feel, my career has in some way prepared me for writing the book. Lots of managers, also have thought leadership as part of their day-to-day work. And so that, writing blog articles, things like that, all of these things I think are good preparation. But despite having an entire career of preparation, learning to write better, still, write well is maybe still a bar that's kind of high, but write better at least. It was very challenging to actually write the manuscript. I started with an outline of just what are all of the things that are interesting, where there's many ways to do it. They don't teach it to you in school because it's sort of a soft skill subject. But through trial and error and real world experience and other resources, we've identified there is actually a best practice. And so I had like a 12-page outline in a Google Doc of just topics, things related to hiring and firing and leadership practices and various technical decision-making processes, things like this. And then just started writing, dumping knowledge into each of those sections as best as I could. It was fortuitous. The only way this book happened was I happened to be in between roles around the time of my wedding. And so it was all sort of very fortuitous. I stopped working about a month before my wedding. And in between wedding planning, just like sat down and wrote sections. After the wedding and the honeymoon, I took another month and just 8 hours a day, every day, sat down and did writing. And Google Docs has there's an extension that will track how many words per day that you write. And so I sort of gamified it for myself. You have to give yourself these little incentives. And for me, numbers is a good incentive.
How many words a day were you putting out?
I think the highest day was about 5,000 words a day. An average day was probably closer to 3,000. The final book is 65,000 some odd words. So it gives you a sense of, it would have been 12 full days if I could do 5,000 a day. That wasn't the case. And then what nobody prepares you for is it takes a Herculean effort and basically a full-time commitment over a significant period of time to write a book. It then takes about an order of magnitude more time to do the editing. And so I went from 0 words on page to a manuscript in probably 3 calendar months. It took well over a year to work with a couple of different editors and of different styles to actually get to the final product, which was published.
All right. Well, congrats on pulling that off. I read the book. I read the whole thing.
It didn't put you to sleep?
Well, I'm not the type of person that falls asleep on a book. I can handle heavy stuff. And I listened to the audiobook while I was driving. It is dense. I will say that. It's like I listened to it start to finish. Yeah. And it is dense. I do believe, like, as you say in the beginning of the book, it's a handbook, good, right? It's a reference. It can be a reference.
Exactly.
But I wanted to read the whole thing.
Power to you. I appreciate that.
I found it very useful. Even as someone with 30 years of experience building software, I learned some things. I agreed a lot with the things you said. It was nice to have some of my own thoughts confirmed. It was a great refresher on some topics I hadn't visited in a while. I shared it with our internal team. My head of development read the whole thing, and he really liked how opinionated you were, how to the point things were. There wasn't a lot of fluff in the book. And I really think it's valuable for anyone in technical leadership to read. So
I appreciate that.
I really enjoyed the book.
It's great to hear that. You write a book, you get feedback from the people you ask for feedback along the way, which is sort of by definition a fairly small group. And then you sort of hope that it resonates. And so it's very gratifying and very kind of you to say those nice things. So thank you.
Yeah. And so in the book, the first 2 sections are about management and hiring. And those aren't really what you might expect for a book about being a CTO. Why did you start with these topics?
Yeah. So, I guess I'll start with being a bit glib, right? When you buy a house, what are the top 3 rules when buying your house? Right? It's location, location, and location. And when it comes to building a strong team at work, what are the top 3 things? It's people, people, and people. Right? If you have the right, what's the saying? The right butts in the right seats is ultimately the highest impact driver on your success. And there's also the double-edged sword of engineers and managers with technical backgrounds probably are not interested in picking up a book that teaches them about technology itself, because by and large, they're already technical experts. Right? You've gotten into technical management, presumably because at some point you were a technical expert and you decided to try management. And so it didn't seem valuable for me to come off as trying to teach people technology itself. I think most of my audience already has some level of expertise in there in some area of technology. Whereas the management stuff it's harder to find a good handbook on that subject. And it's not something people are naturally good at. I modeled the book off of the Great CEO Within by Matt Moshery. Absolutely loved it. He did a fantastic job. Super valuable. And I loved, again, how directly to the point it was, and how, it covered those topics that are critical to day-to-day of running a business, but aren't typically found in your larger business book. Right? You can read Jim Collins' Good to Great. You can read Hard Thing About Hard Things. There's a long list of excellent business books that are, recommended in most MBA programs that teach very valuable lessons about business strategy, about organizational culture, but it doesn't tell you about the meat and potatoes of managing the logistics of raising fundraising. Right? It's a topic in Good to Great. It doesn't teach you the logistics of a hiring pipeline for engineers or designing interviews for software engineers. These, it's not taught in the broader books. And so some best practices there is really what I thought would be most useful as a reference guide for other managers.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's something I've experienced myself. I mean, I'm an engineer who's now somehow a CEO, and I always have something to learn on management. And that was I like the tips in there, and it's an area I always need to grow in. If you were to pull out some of the key points out of the management section, what do you think those would be that you want to share here?
One of the quotes I use in the book is from Otto von Bismarck, which is, "Fools learn from their mistakes. I prefer to learn from the mistakes of others." Right? Which is to say, to translate that, in management, there's a lot you can learn through trial and error, but due to the nature of management, those errors will be costly. Right? Either to your business or to morale on your team. You might unintentionally hurt an employee or hurt their opinion of yourself or the company. So the consequences are real of making, sort of amateur management mistakes. when there are best practices to avoid those mistakes. And so I really wanted to focus on what sort of, not necessarily universal truths, but generally applicable truths to management to try and avoid some of those issues, like setting clear goalposts for employees and performance. And it's very common that you have employees will come to you and say, what do I have to do to get a promotion? Right? Very common one-on-one topic. The fact that the employee came to the manager and asked that question signifies that the organization has failed to establish clear goalposts in advance. Right? That is a symptom of a lack of a process or lack of clarity within the company. Now, in an early stage startup, of course, that's perhaps excusable. You haven't gotten there yet. And so this is, if you go to any of your 10,000, 100,000 person tech companies, these things are already very clear. Right? If you go work at Stripe or Google, there's a very sophisticated internal wiki, probably with various spreadsheets and matrices that are very precise about to get from level A to level B, you must do these things. And in a startup, you go from nothing. You don't want to go to that level of sophistication because you don't have 10,000 employees. But you want to get started, right? And so what are the best practices to get started, providing that clarity and those clear goalposts? So employees don't have to go to their manager and ask that question. And even more importantly, managers have a consistent answer they can provide to all employees, so everybody's got a sense of being treated the same way and having the same opportunity to drive value for the company and drive their own careers.
Yeah, that brings up something I read in the book about, I think you said that you tried to tie it to production, so that it would be a win for the company and a win for the employee. So if you're actually producing code or new features at X rate, that puts you at this earning power, and it's a win-win. What were the metrics you were suggesting there?
Yeah, I think one has to be a little careful about quantitatively measuring something like production or velocity, especially in software engineering. But the general principle of, as a manager at a smaller company designing a performance review system, you have the opportunity to very clearly align incentives between the employee and what matters for your business. And that's going to be different depending on each company. And so, some traditional metrics would be things like software quality. How many bugs has the person shipped, or contribution to pull requests? Are you reviewing other people's code and helping them level up, or participating in an interview process? These kinds of metrics are relatively applicable, but others might not. Others might be unique to your company. At Gruntwork, for example, our performance review system includes public thought leadership. Right? Part of our brand as a company is being seen as DevOps experts. We've been in the space a long time. We've published books. We have a blog with a ton of history and lots of traffic talking about infrastructure as code. And so it's important to our company we maintain that brand. And that is a business value, something we hold ourselves accountable to. And so the way that translates into our culture is part of how everybody individually is measured is your contribution towards maintaining that public thought leadership. And that can be done in a number of different ways: participating in community discussions, writing blog posts, creating new features that are widely adopted on open source tools, things of that nature, right? And that's unique to our company's domain and the direction we're trying to go. And I encourage leaders to think, what's unique about your company that adds value, that differentiates your business? How do your employees contribute to that? And can you hold them accountable and create an incentive for them to move in that direction?
Yeah, it's hard to get away from the elephant in the room here on this topic, which is what everybody wants is to have some sort of measure of productivity. And you even mentioned in the book, and I've experienced myself, it's very difficult, right? And you hear people finally sort of saying it's a very tough thing to quantify. I think you do mention, features shipped, story points, going back to your topic of you want to have it clearly defined what you need to do to get promoted and to get to the next level. If it's sort of vanity metrics, like, oh, you spoke publicly about this or you participated in a review, really what the company cares about is productivity and what they're doing for the product. I would assume that has got to be the heart of what people...
I think I'm not sure I would agree that that's universally true. I think expectations need to be very different depending on seniority. Right, a junior engineer, I expect to produce, fewer innovations, to have less mentoring and less coaching of their coworkers, to have less, public thought leadership. I hire a junior engineer because they're going to learn. and they're going to be effective at, doing the job of engineering, and they're going to be learning and absorbing and becoming a more senior engineer over time. And we want people with lots of capacity and lots of room, excitement for that growth. If I'm hiring a senior engineer, I'm expecting you, of course, you're going to write great code, you're going to understand technology, but you're also going to have an impact that's larger than yourself. And so I'm going to measure things beyond just your performance and productivity of features. You're going to be mentoring other people. You're going to be advancing our standards. You're going to come up with ideas to incorporate new tools into our process. You're going to be pushing back on management when they do dumb things, which we do all the time because we're not perfect. So I'm expecting, senior staff, principal level engineers to have an outsized impact beyond the software that they're writing.
I agree that some of those metrics you pulled in or things you pulled in lead to productivity. Like if you're mentoring a junior developer or a team of junior developers, you're improving their productivity. And so, yes, if you're working on new tools that make the dev team process more efficient, that's ultimately leading to productivity. So I get that. But I don't want to linger too long on that subject.
I'll just leave with one idea, or an idea and a half. I do believe in Goodhart's law, right? When a metric becomes a target, it ceases to become an effective measure, right? And so if you're measuring people on story points shipped or lines of code or pull requests merged, right, you quickly introduce incentives and people can game systems and you lose the value, right? And so you have to be very careful about quantitatively measuring things like this in performance reviews, unless it's very well constrained and it's very obvious that if somebody games that system, it's actually good for everybody. And my favorite example of this is pull request size, right? Well, how do you game the system of being measured for shipping small pull requests? You make smaller pull requests, which is exactly the thing we wanted to begin with. And if you game the system by submitting a handful of one-line pull requests, I'm totally okay with that. They're really fast to review, really easy to test. And if you can manage to make forward progress on your stories with 1 or 2 line changes, at some point it becomes ridiculous and ineffective. But as long as they're individually complete and make a meaningful change, that's an easy PR to review and merge. So that is a desirable behavior at the end of the day. Whereas higher level metrics, especially if they're output metrics as opposed to input metrics, very quickly become murky. Software development's a creative business. We don't know what we're doing until we're doing it. And so it's very hard to fairly hold people accountable for that over a larger period of time.
So a quick pause here. I wanted to tell you a bit about why I started my software staffing company, Scalable Path. Back in 2008, I was working on a client project with some developers in Argentina, and I saw how amazing it was working with people in my time zone who were just as available as people in my office. So in 2010, I started Scalable Path to help companies take advantage of this underutilized talent pool. And since then, we've built a platform of over 40,000 developers, and we've placed over 600 of them with over 300 clients. So if you're looking to hire top-notch dev talent at a fraction of the cost of hiring locally, visit scalablepath.com/commit-push. And as a listener of the podcast, you can get 20% off your first month. I'd love for you to give us a try. All right, I got another question for you here. In your hiring section of the book, you're talking mainly about hiring traditional full-time employees. And there's a lot of good tips in there. I really liked the section on interviews, how to structure interviews. But where do you think contingent workforce or contractors fit into the equation? You didn't really touch that in the book.
Yep, that's a great point. And it's simply an oversight. There should be a chapter on that.
Okay.
So I appreciate you calling that out. Version 2, we'll have something on contingent and contract workforce. There's 2 parts to this. Fundamentally, when the business decides to hire, there should be a reflection, or at least a asking of the question, is the need that we're hiring for a long-term need, especially at a startup? It's very common, I've been asked 100 times, like, Zach, can we just not hire somebody full-time to build this particular thing? Well, you ask yourself the question, this particular thing we're building, are we maintaining it forever? Do we know if we're maintaining it forever? Is it a one-off project which needs to still prove its right to exist? And if the answer to those questions is uncertain or no, then a contingent, contract workforce makes a lot of sense, especially to get things started. So I'm a big believer. We use them all the time. Gruntwork has a pretty sizable team of part-time and contract employees. And, there's a couple of reasons why you necessarily need them. It's temporary, right? That's the easiest one. there's a specific expertise you want to hire for. And this is actually what Gruntwork does. We maintain a product that covers a huge amount of domain knowledge in AWS, more so than any one person could reasonably in a lifetime understand. And so we hire contractors who have a very deep expertise in a slice of how the cloud works. And we hire 5 or 10 of those in various, rabbit holes, so to speak, or various depths in AWS. And between that group of people, we get a tremendous breadth of expertise, far more than any one person we could get in a full-time hire with the cost of maybe only 2 hires kind of thing.
Because they're all sort of part-time or...
Exactly, yeah. And it happens to meet with the business product needs, the development needs that we're looking at to have those folks on board part-time. And so that ends up being a very cost-effective way to get a tremendous amount of knowledge applied to the problems at hand. The more common solution I see, especially at startups, is, well, it's just cheaper, right, to outsource. And then, you get into the conversation of what are you buying? How are you going to manage the process along the way? And what are your expectations at the end of that process? Because I think that the biggest failure modes with sort of certainly, offshore low cost outsourcing and software is, you expect a high quality product with no oversight along the way for bottom dollar. And, fast, cheap, high quality, choose to, you just don't get all of them. And so if you know the quality doesn't matter, or you have a lot of opportunity to provide oversight, then the bottom cost can be very effective, especially for early prototypes. You don't know if they're going to work. You want to try 5 different prototypes or 5 different ideas as fast as humanly possible, as cheaply as possible. Great. But don't expect the code base that you get when you paid $6 an hour for software engineers to be the code base that you build your company on for the next 5 years, kind of thing.
So also in the book, you mention your experience working as a full-time CTO. And has that always been the case? Have you always just been all in on one company, or have you ever worked as a fractional CTO?
I spent a stint of about 2.5 or 3 years doing exclusively fractional and contract type work. Most of my career has been full-time as a startup employee, but I've probably worked with, about 10 or so different companies on a fractional basis along the way. I haven't done it in a couple of years, but there were a few good stints there.
Do you think there are certain situations where that is beneficial for a company?
Yeah. That's a bit of a leading question talking to Damien at Scalable Path. Of course, yes.
Yeah, I mean, you want me to answer my own question? I mean,
I think your business model is great.
If you can't afford to bring on a full-time CTO, there's plenty of guys like you that are that have great expertise like yourself and are willing to, give you a quarter of their time or something like that. And that might work for you as a company, as a startup.
My mental model is lots of companies are very capable finding a team of mid-level, early senior software engineers to execute a project. And the failure mode, especially if they're not full-time employees and they don't have, long-term investment in the company, with hiring outsourced staff as a group, is they need to be pointed in the right direction. They need to understand the business well. They need to deeply understand the technology. The foundational patterns that are put in place for the technology need to be, well-established best practice to set the project up for success. And if you have a group of 4 or 5 people that are loosely organized, that aren't committed, that don't have strong leadership, it's hard to get that high-quality outcome. And so whenever I hire more than one contractor for a project, I make sure to have a dedicated, super senior, very experienced fractional CTO type person. Maybe they're not writing the majority of the code, but they're making the most important decisions, and they're tying the team together so that the final product matches the quality expectations that the company needs. And without that, you end up, in my experience and what I've seen and talked to folks, you end up going off the rails pretty quickly.
It can happen for sure. So moving into some of the more technical parts of the book, toward the end of the book, I really liked how you just had sort of a common sense attitude about keeping things simple. For example, if you don't know whether you should be doing a monolith or microservices, you should probably just do a monolith. Or if you don't know if you should be doing a single monorepo versus a multi-repo, you should probably just do single repo. And generally, I think that's sort of a philosophy on life. Like if you're not sure about something and one's more complex, probably just keep it simple. So I really liked that part of the book.
There's a joke at Gruntwork. People sort of make fun of me for it in a friendly way, that I have the ruthlessly pragmatic perspective. That it's it's very simple at the end of the day. Do we need the capabilities of the fancier solution? No, not yet. Okay, simpler solution then.
Yeah, I really like that sentiment. So kind of going a little back into team productivity, you got a little into DORA metrics, and I think you got into this one topic where there was improving the developer experience actually improved like 3 out of the 4 DORA metrics. Do you remember what I'm talking about here?
Yeah. Not sure the specific example, but the general idea I definitely would have written about and have seen in practice many times, and big believer.
Yeah, I'll kind of bring it back to something we're experiencing at Scalable Path. We have this modern Next.js React application that we were very excited to modernize to. And it turns out that now our build times are really long. And so when have a feature branch and we want to deploy it to an environment to be QA'd, it can take 30 minutes. And I think it's a big bottleneck for us. I think there are still opportunities for us to reduce that deploy time. We're working on that. I was hoping this would jog your memory, but it does seem to me that when you're talking about trying to improve the efficiency of a dev team, a lot of what you want to do is reduce the time that they're spending on, I think in one book I read, it was like called outer loop. There's like the outer loop activities, which are things like,
I love that,
deploying, doing code reviews even. And what's inner loop is like you're actually solving problems, writing code, and you want to reduce that outer loop stuff. And the pain point for us really is a lot of this outer loop. But there was some point in the book where it actually seemed that by just changing, I feel if we can change our own deploy time, reduce our own deploy time, and then make it easier to QA things and then bring that branch more quickly back into the trunk, it's going to like have all of these knockoff improvements to the team efficiency. And I really like that section of the book, and I'm hoping this jogs your memory a bit on some of the stuff you talked about in there.
I like the phrasing, the outer loop, inner loop. That's new to me. I think that captures it really well. You have to think, what is the multiplying effect of saving a developer 10 minutes a day? Right? How many developers do you have? How many days are they actually writing software? What is the cost of a software developer? Presumably very high. Especially, nowadays we're so efficient with AI and all these kinds of things. So that 10 minutes could write lots of code. Those costs add up very quickly, right? And whether it's waiting for builds or it's diagnosing errors because the Docker Compose file isn't clearly documented and it's spitting out an error that's very hard to diagnose, or fighting with Webpack configurations in the JavaScript build world, like all of these things are not spending time solving the actual business problems, right? They're logistics problems. Yeah, the art of software engineering. And you want as much time as possible actually on the business problems, right? Understanding the problem that you're modeling, converting that into, actionable business logic, testing that logic, so on and so forth. And so I'm a huge believer in investing in developer experience to make it really, really easy to get the actual work done. If you imagine any other type of engineering, right? You're designing a building, right? What kind of software do modern architects use, right? We're not still writing, doing all of your blueprints on physical paper, right? Nowadays, you have all kinds of analysis and simulation that can be done, and stress modeling, and all these concepts that are way above my head to help architects do their job really well. And if you were to hire an architect to design your building, you'd want them using the latest, greatest, cutting edge, whatever, to build the safest building as most cost effectively as possible. And you wouldn't want that architect like running out to Staples to buy more blue paper and pencils, right? And charging you for that time, right? Which is the equivalent of like debugging a failing CI build in software engineering, right? That's not what we're paid to do. That's not generating the actual value. And so, anytime you hit those sort of paper cuts or those miniature roadblocks, in my take and the culture I want to build is you always invest in getting rid of those roadblocks. Automation fundamentally unlocks velocity. And so automating all those things away to make the developer's life easier, spend time on the work that actually matters. If I could ask your JavaScript builds system, is it, I mean, not to get too deep in the weeds on the technology, is it Node.js, Bun, Deno, Rust build tools, traditional stuff?
I'd have to bring in my head of development, Rafael, to really get into, because I'm a little distanced from it. I just know that it takes 30 minutes, and I'm constantly saying, hey guys, how can we reduce this? Because I know just that optimizing that one thing will probably have huge multiplying effects on the efficiency of the team.
Yeah, especially testing feature branches, like the ability to do that quickly. You get the feedback to developers that much faster from cross-departmentally, QA, from product, feedback internally that much quicker. There's a lot of really good feature branches is a huge productivity boost. Which
kind of rolls into this next topic. I'm kind of curious to try this roast and toast idea. Like if there's one technology or tool that you think is just overhyped or even harmful right now, does anything come to mind for you in that? And then we can also get to toast one where you think, oh, this is actually a great thing that's going to stick around and there's a lot of hype, or it doesn't even have to be hyped. But yeah, either side.
Yeah. I think I don't want to go so far as roasting so much as expressing a pragmatic perspective to tie it back. I think especially in the JavaScript ecosystem, things have always moved very quickly, and that's always been a criticism of the ecosystem. I think in the past year or two, it's actually even accelerated the rate at which there are new tools, new paradigms, new ways of doing things, even above and beyond the craziness that was the teens. And it's really cool stuff. Like, I watch all the Deno release videos and I've seen the recent releases of Bun. Like, it's very cool. I'm really excited about the future. But I have sort of, I follow sort of a ThoughtWorks radar approach to these sorts of things, which is to say, I love that there's innovation happening. Generally, especially when there's competing innovation, it's not for certain that these things will still be here in 5 years, certainly in their current form. It's not for certain that the ecosystem around the tools is going to be sophisticated, have good documentation, be, really low defect, so on and so forth. And so I'm going to take a little bit of a trial or a wait and see approach before picking up the new innovation that looks super cool. In my book, I talk a lot about boring technology, right? You don't get fired for using the tried and tested tools that work well, that will still be here in 10 years, right? Nobody's going to get fired for choosing Postgres as their database in 2025. You could use there's really cool stuff about hosted SQLite. That is like intellectually fascinating. I really hope it becomes successful and widely adopted. But at least as you and I are talking today, I think it's pretty fair to describe that stuff as still cutting edge and not yet fully proven out in the world. And so, maybe we'll do a proof of concept on that kind of thing, but I'm not going to start a new startup that I want to be here for 20 years, focused entirely around that one technology choice, for example. And in the toast category, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I think Cursor is the coolest thing. I've been using Copilot since the day Copilot came out, and that was nice, right? Definitely a productivity boost. But integration that Cursor's got with AI nowadays, just the prompting is just so much more sophisticated and integrated in my workflow, and whatever it's doing behind the scenes to try and figure out the intention behind the work I'm doing and create much more sophisticated tab completes is absolutely fantastic. And I'm really excited about the direction that's taken us.
Do you have your whole team using that?
We do. We've rolled out a Cursor subscription. There's a Slack channel called AI at Work, and pinned to that channel is the invite link. And so anybody who's not using it can just instantly join our organization. The Cursor must love it. What a great business model. Basically saying anybody at our company that wants to give them money can do that. But the productivity upside is totally there.
Cool. I've heard good things about it. I haven't used it. I mean, can you go into a little more detail on how it's better over, Copilot, what you were using before?
I don't mechanically know what it's doing behind the scenes to achieve this, but the experience, if you're familiar with Copilot, you'll be typing a line of code, and then Copilot is sort of using that in some way, shape, or form to guess how you're going to finish that line of code and maybe guess the next 5 lines of code, right? And so the total capability of autocomplete in VS Code with Copilot is additive, right? It's going to type the next between 1 and, let's say, 1,000 characters that you might have typed in a row, contiguously. cursor, in addition to, deeper integration with chat and things like that, it'll recognize, so say for example, I was updating some documentation a couple hours ago, and the documentation was talking about repositories, plural. And in this particular context, it actually made sense to talk about a singular repository. And so I changed one sentence, which was the preamble, which changed the meaning of the rest of the paragraphs. Instead of multiple repositories or single, I changed a single instance of the word repositories to repository. And then instantaneously later, Copilot had highlighted in the next several paragraphs all of the IESs and replaced them with a Y. And all I had to do is hit tab, and it fixed that problem. Right? It understood mechanically that, I'm changing a plural to a singular. And it went and just did that, which is not a thing that Copilot by default does. And this is, of course, in Docs as a trivial example.
Well, it's funny that your example is about just regular writing and not even
code. But now imagine how powerful that is with code.
Yeah.
Right? To have that semantic understanding of the type of change you're making in that context, and then just apply that for you, so you don't even have to do the thinking.
Cool. One place I knew where I was going to go if we're getting into roasting, and I'm not saying I'm roasting JavaScript as a whole. I mean, we're using it. I think there are cases where you're doing highly interactive user interfaces where it's absolutely necessary. But, I've been recently turned on to this sort of hypermedia systems trend. In the process of reading the book by Carson Gross, Hypermedia Systems, and his framework HTMX. And I know there's other similar frameworks out there, but I am a little bit maybe it's because I'm almost 50, and I grew up in this old school world where we were closer to the Web 1.0 way of doing things. But it does make me think that maybe we've gone a bit too far with the complexity of the JavaScript, and we just got so built up. And next thing you know, we'll have 30-minute builds of our JavaScript app. And is this necessary? I know there's a certain number of apps that don't need all of this, right? And people are just building these apps with all this heavy JavaScript because that's just what you do. But so I'm wondering if you've thought about this, been intrigued by this movement or at all?
Yeah. I'm not familiar with hypermedia specifically, but I certainly have lots of both success stories and horror stories in and around the JavaScript ecosystem over the past decade or so.
Well, it's not just hypermedia. Things like Livewire, you see David Heinemeier Hansson sort of talking about these sort of things of where instead of, building this complex, single page application where every request is, going back to the server and getting JSON and then re-rendering the entire UI, just treating it more like old school HTML and just getting little bits.
The quick framework, things like this.
Yes.
I'm going to fall back again on my typical pragmatic perspective. It's a tool for the job kind of thing. At Gruntwork, we have multiple documentation sites. One of them is written in Docusaurus, or actually all of them are Docusaurus. And most recently, we've started using Astro and Starlight. And I think it's just a question that, the architecture of the two, Docusaurus versus Starlight, is in some ways similar, in some ways very different. But the net result, of course, is the same. It's a documentation site that's supposed to be really fast and very pretty. But what we have found, comparing and contrasting them, is it's always just a question of what are the needs in this particular circumstance and which tool best aligns with those needs. And I think what you get in the JavaScript ecosystem is there's a lot of, for lack of a better phrase, celebrity. Next.js, for example, is just a really big brand. And Next.js is great, but it is not the right tool for every problem. Not every JavaScript website should be written in Next.js. But if you're going to hire a contractor to go build your website and that contractor doesn't want to get fired and they want to pick, the standard tool, are they likely to be experienced with Next.js and likely to pull it off the shelf just because it's convenient? Even if it might not necessarily, maybe it's too sophisticated for the needs of the client, maybe that probably happens every day. And so there is this challenge of, because the ecosystem is so fragmented and expertise is so fragmented, people tend to use what they know as opposed to necessarily what's most applicable. My most recent company prior to working at Gruntwork was a finance application where we did some pretty sophisticated things with forms and data that loaded in. And, a really nice next setup was wonderful to work in. Like, it was a really nice match to the problem, and we were able to make changes quickly. But there are other instances where, I would not want to go build a documentation site in Next.js, for example. It's way too much. And so it's a consequence, I think, of just how many things are out there. And, unlike Rails, for example, where you have sort of a single dominant framework in the industry, that framework is super mature, super robust. Everybody, not everybody, but the majority of developers in that language are familiar with that framework. It's the tool. It's been well adapted to large scale and small scale. In JavaScript, there's that fragmentation, the expertise is not all there, and you get quite a few more challenges as a result. And then, of course, you have the language, which, not designed for its current purpose and gets some friction as a result.
So taking us back a little bit to the AI topic, how do you see AI impacting the jobs, not only, how we operate as software developers, but I'm a little bit concerned that there's going to be, not in every industry, there's going to be straight up job replacement of people. Do you think that these AI agents, AI coding agents are on the cusp of being good enough to be where a senior developer or a manager could just be managing some AI agents instead of some junior developers?
I mean, I might eat these words in a few years, but I don't think so. I think there are use cases where, what's the name of the tool, is like 0x or 0 day or something like that, where you build your MVP of your JavaScript powered website with just a couple prompts. That's brilliant, right? And I think that use case is only going to get better. I don't see that extending to a sophisticated application with lots of business logic that's deeply integrated with all the kinds of things that a business needs. So I absolutely, calling it right here, right now, software developers are here to stay. I do worry a lot about training of new software developers and how much harder it's going to be a junior developer now than it was 10, 15 years ago. A, because I don't know, like the number of those jobs might be fewer. And B, because it's just so easy to have the AI do the mechanics, the minutia of software engineering for you, so that you're not going to experience the pain of being forced to take a step back and say, well, why is this working this way, and become more of an expert. So I worry about the incentives there. But I mean, big picture, if you look at software in 2025, like how are we doing as an industry that creates code? This is a controversial opinion, perhaps. The only good software on the planet Earth is written by maybe 20 companies are capable of writing good software. If your name is not Google or Microsoft or Apple or Netflix or companies in that tier, you probably don't write great software. And your application probably is somewhat buggy. It probably isn't translated into all the languages it needs to be translated in. It probably doesn't account for all the different edge cases that happen in the real world. If I go to the App Store and I need to download a new app from even a mid-sized company for some device I just bought, the amount of dread and fear I have about the quality of that software is immeasurable. It's just that, like, I will not buy products that need software that wasn't developed by a major software company because I know it's going to be terrible. And I think that's not that controversial of an opinion.
It's a pretty strong word.
I mean, I've got Smart Light software that is just the worst thing in the world to use. Crashes.
Are you including TerraGrunt? Or Grunt, Grunt.
We are a professional software company. We our business is writing software. But if your business is selling something else that's not software, and you wrote some software, it's likely not very good. And I think that's bad. In 2025, it makes me sad that I don't have confidence that any arbitrary company out there would have written an Android or an iPhone app that's great. And I think we could do better. And I'm optimistic that over the coming years, AI will help non-software companies write better software. And hopefully that makes being a user of software that isn't made by professional software companies better. And I will feel more confident buying, an air conditioner that happens to have a dedicated app.
It's a known fact that it's improving developer productivity, AI. I think it has a lot of potential in QA, writing automated tests, like
tremendous potential in QA.
We're only scratching the surface there. I do worry about people's jobs being replaced in a market that's already sort of with tons of layoffs and things like that. But I'm glad to hear you think that software engineers aren't going anywhere for a while. I hope that's true.
I think if you really distill its essence of what is it to be a great software engineer, lots of people can physically write good code, right? It's knowing what problems to solve that is actually the hardest part of software engineering, and then breaking those problems down into more manageable solutions. And I think I'm not sure I see a world where an AI agent has all of the context of a business the same way a senior developer does, and can identify, the customer asked for X, and so we should deliver Y, right? Like that bridge is really challenging. And the path for an AI to do that consistently in the same way a product manager or senior developer does that'd be interesting to see.
We will see, because there were things that I thought a couple of years ago that AI would not be able to do that I'm already thinking, well, the way things are progressing, it may be able to. So we may be eating our words shortly, as you say. So we're coming up on our time here. We didn't touch much on your coaching, what you do there. I mean, I could frame it in terms of your book a little bit, even like for a CTO, when should you consider getting coaching?
If you are in a management position and your business does not have a very structured management training program, you should be seeking external advice to become a better manager. Whether that's management mentor, a group, external management training program, or a dedicated management or executive coach. Like, it is just too expensive to learn on the job the basic best practices of growing and scaling an organization. And the opportunity cost is tremendous. If you are a leader at a startup and a growing company, your investors have given you millions of dollars to go from where you are today to 10 times bigger. Building the organization that does that is hard. There are more ways to do it wrong than there are to do it right. The ROI on improving the decision-making of your top decision makers with whatever the cost of a management program or a coach is tremendous. And your business will pay, and your employees will experience the benefits of that. So if you're in a position of making really high impact decisions and you don't yet have the experience to frame those decisions really, really well, then I'm a big believer, and this was certainly my journey and the journey of many I talked to, of leveling up faster with somebody else's help is a great idea.
I totally agree. Where can people find you online and get in touch with you?
Yeah, I'm startupctocoach.com. That'll get you directly to the website, or you can find me, Zach Goldberg, on LinkedIn, and happy to chat.
Great. Well, it's been a pleasure. Been a super fun conversation. So glad to have you.
Thank you so much, Damien. It's been an absolute privilege to join the podcast today.
All right, Zach, take care.
Cheers.
Well, that's a wrap on this episode of Commit and Push. If you found it valuable, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. And if you're building a team, check out scalablepath.com to find top developers. Until next time, keep building, keep pushing.